Terrorism is the unlawful use of force against persons or property that is meant to intimidate or coerce a government or its people in furtherance of a political or social issue. Many terrorists are viewed as being evil, insane, immoral people. But what we find out is that most terrorists actually expel individuals who are unstable within their organizations. To a terrorist, violence is a morally justified response that is based on their belief system to further their social or political cause. There's two types of terrorism. There's domestic terrorism, which is terrorism that operates mainly within the United States. And then there's international terrorism, which are organizations that operate outside the United States. Sometimes they come in and do terrorist acts within the United States, such as the World Trade Center bombings. Most terrorism, international terrorism, aimed at United States citizens occurs outside the United States. So when traveling outside the U.S., you shouldn't be overly worried about terrorism, but nevertheless, there's certain areas, obviously, where terrorist attacks on U.S. citizens are more likely to occur. So if you're going to be traveling, or somebody you love is going to be traveling overseas, especially, you would want to check the State Department's website to see if there's any advisories warning against travel in that region. The most common cause of death within terrorist attacks are suicide bombings. Next to that are assault ambush style type of attacks, arson and firebombing, and lastly hostage attacks that end up in death. The most common victims that die due to terrorism, the vast majority are civilians, followed by police forces, military security forces, and children. To classify certain types of terrorist organizations, within the U.S. there are right-wing terrorists which adhere to anti-government or racist ideology, and they oftentimes engage in hate-type crimes. For example, neo-Nazi, KKK, Aryan Nations types of groups. Then there's left-wing extremists, and they oftentimes take extreme stances on certain government policies, such as deforestation, environmental type causes, as well as discrimination, those types of things. For example, there's a golf course being built. A small group of left-wing extremists may come in and sabotage equipment or whip donuts on the greens just to try and scare people off. And then there's special interest extremists, which is a term used by the FBI, which means that there's activities revolving around one certain issue, such as the right-wing and left-wing extremists. Then the use of NBCs, which are nuclear, biological, chemical warfare. Some terrorist organizations, more specifically international terrorist organizations, are more likely to try to acquire an NBC or have one. And then bioterrorism, which is an offshoot of the NBCs, which are extremists or terrorist organizations that use biological agents in their terrorism. You may remember a few years ago they had the anthrax scare at the U.S. Capitol. When looking at terrorist typology, we can see three different types of terrorists that people typically fall into. The rationally motivated terrorists are people who consider the pros and the cons of their actions. They look at the goals of their organizations and the possible consequences of their actions. Oftentimes they try to limit civilian death. For example, abortion clinic bombers or environmental activists, those types of people. Psychologically motivated terrorists are driven by a profound sense of failure or inadequacy and seek revenge. We might see this in Theodore Kaczynski, who was the Unabomber. People that have felt beaten up by society and want to lash out back. And then there's the culturally motivated terrorists. These are the people that feel like their national heritage, their way of life, and their culture is being impacted very negatively by outside forces, and they want to prevent that. So who are terrorists? Who join terrorist organization? Well, terrorists tend to be a very heterogeneous group, meaning we really don't know. There's no exact profile. We have to look at the exact situation and terrorist organizations before we can start coming up with correlates of terrorist demographics and personality factors. Nevertheless, there are some overlaps that we're going to get into. Oftentimes, they feel a sense of helplessness over a certain situation. They lack the skills and ability to change their certain situations, so they'll want to join a group because as a group they're more likely to accomplish a task. A lot of young people who join terrorist organizations tend to lack self-esteem and a sense of who they are. They want to belong to something. Social learning theory, again, which has been a repeating theme throughout this course, is something that is very important for especially kids if they're given messages that Americans are bad, or black people are bad, or or whatever, or people who are bad to the environment are bad, people that have abortions and give abortions are bad. If we keep hearing that throughout our childhoods and early adult life, we're more likely to join a cause to prevent those things. Suicide bombers are a little bit unique, thankfully. Nevertheless, there's internationally that's a fairly significant, as we've heard, very significant problem. People who are suicide bombers aren't depressed people. They're not your typical murder-suicide type of person. They're people that believe that their death is justified, that their death will bring honor to their family, and that they will be in a higher place in the afterlife if they go through with the suicide act. So how does a person actually become a terrorist? They don't roll out of bed one day and decide, I'm going to be this radical and I want to terrorize people. It's a much more gradual process than that. People start disengaging with their self-censorship. Like-minded people often will get together in groups for long, intense periods of time, and a risky shift sometimes happens, which these groups, non-terrorist groups, start developing beliefs and start making decisions that are much more extreme than when they initially started to get together. So specific terrorist groups, they tend to look for specific populations in which to recruit. So people that are already partially radicalized, people that have grown up, with the seed planted that, certain races are bad or certain things are bad, certain cultures, whatever. So once they join, people don't realize, but they're going through a socialization process, which is a gradual transformation to extreme radicalization. They're oftentimes isolated from more rational family and friends. Oftentimes peer influence is associated with joining terrorist organizations. So if you see, 5 out of your 6 buddies joining a terrorist organization, you're much more likely to join. People with limited cognitive constructs about the world, they have a real limited worldview, oftentimes because they're not given a good liberal education. So these are basically narrow-minded people that don't know that that there's many more factors out there than just what they're seeing. Suicide bombers, they're oftentimes given a bunch of point of no return tasks. So once they, oftentimes they're real nervous to take on a suicide assignment, but the two terrorist leaders, they know that if they, get a commitment, have them send out videos to, or make a suicide video saying, who they are and what they believe in and that kind of thing. And if they send out letters to their families, tell them that they love them and that they, are doing this to further their cause, they're much more likely to do it because they're past that, again, that point of no return. In looking at terrorist leadership, we see that a lot of terrorist groups, especially the more successful types and complex types of terrorist organizations, have a strong hierarchy. Many of their members want to become leaders, and the higher a person is up a leadership chain, the more likely they are to be very much committed to the mission of an organization. Leaders of terrorist organizations are unquestionably seen as legit and commanding of respect and power. Probably one of the most common and significant characteristics of a terrorist leader is charisma. they're individuals who can inspire their members. There's a saying, beware the charismatic leader, because they can, oftentimes trick anybody into just about anything by just their ability to persuade, which is another big skill, is communication. They oftentimes can communicate very effectively through written and verbal communications. They oftentimes have traits that are common within more legit leaders. Psychopathy is likely a common factor in terrorist leadership. Probably not always, but we do see that psychopathy is more common the higher up we go in a hierarchy within even legit organizations and governments. So what happens when individuals or small groups of people not associated with terrorist organizations commit terrorist acts? These are called lone wolf attacks. In the United States, we're especially vulnerable to these types of attacks because of our laws that allow people to have the freedoms that we love. But sometimes there's a side effect to every good thing. Lone wolf attacks are difficult to predict and track. They're out there, they're kind of by themselves. We can't follow the money and things like that because we don't know about them a lot of times. So in the United States, we see the most lone wolf types of attacks from the far right extremists. These are people that are white supremacists, anti-abortion, anti-government types of folks. Psychological disorders are very common within terrorist organization, within the lone wolf attackers. Oftentimes they have poor social skills. We think of Theodore Kaczynski again, the Unabomber. Also a lone wolf attacker who didn't have psychopathology is Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombings. So looking at the psychosocial constructs of terrorism, we find a few common themes. Cultural devaluation is when a person or group of people scapegoat another population. For example, when people believe that they're being repressed by a certain person or people, they're more likely to lash out towards that group of people. Cognitive and moral restructuring takes thoughts that or changes thoughts to justify terrorist ideology and terrorism. We often see this in other types of criminals. We call them criminal rationalizations. Dehumanization occurs when we believe that another group of people aren't as human as we are. You see this a lot of times in the differing religious bickering, believing that other certain group is not as equal as we are. Therefore, when we hurt them, it's not that big of a deal. And then the de-individualization occurs when a terrorist join a terrorist organization. They take away their personhood, and then they commit an act, and they're just following orders, which reduces their personal responsibility in their mind.